My project, Reproducing the Gender Binary, is a study of gender representation in the Human Anatomy and Physiology textbook. This study is inspired by my background as a health science and WIGS double major. In my studies, I've noticed a disconnect between the natural sciences understanding of gender and the social sciences understanding of gender. I've studied gender from both perspectives in both majors, and I've found that there is a lack of communication between these fields. In a class for my WIGS capstone, I read a study by Emily Martin called The Egg and the Sperm, which sparked my interest in studying gender representation in scientific textbooks. Emily Martin found that biases exist within reproductive science textbooks, and her landmark study identified that in these textbooks, the egg is typically determined to be a passive object of fertilization, whereas the sperm is an active agent of fertilization. She found that this bias against the female gender, any bias towards the male gender, perpetuates health inequities between the genders and justifies sexist attitudes in healthcare professionals, which, as we know, is incredibly dangerous. So I'm inspired by Emily Martin and by my double majors to pursue this research. It's helpful to first understand what is gender. Biologists typically understand gender to be binary. So we have men and we have women correlating with male sex and female sex. In the social scientists, we understand that gender is fluid. And there can be a variety of gender identities that are not necessarily determined by a biological sex. So why is it important to be thinking about gender as we are learning, studying, and teaching about human health? We found that gender inequities are widespread worldwide. And the World Health Organization has recently described these gender inequities in healthcare as unequal, unfair, ineffective, and inefficient. We also know that our gender does affect our health. This includes our perception of our own gender, our perception of others' genders, and others' perceptions of us. These can all influence our health throughout our lifetime, especially when we're considering biases that healthcare professionals might have subconsciously. We also know that healthcare is not equally accessible to it, speaking along the gender binary, men and women. And studies have found that even in older adults during the COVID pandemic, we're certainly considering the lived experiences of older adults who might need more hospitalization than younger folks who contract COVID. And although this study is not COVID specific, it's certainly relevant that due to limited economic resources, women receive fewer hospital services in comparison to men. So it certainly is relevant to be studying gender inequities as we are learning about human health. So what can we do about this? In a World Health Organization report, the World Health Organization advised that in order to improve health inequities. We must take action to improve the evidence base for policies by changing gender imbalances in both the content and the processes of health research. I would argue that this certainly does extend to analyzing our textbooks and making sure that the media that we are using to educate healthcare professionals does not demonstrate any gender imbalances or gender biases. My research question is asking, how is gender represented by the images and figures of the Human Anatomy and Physiology textbook used by the Gettysburg College Health Science Department? So of course, the textbook that I used for this analysis is our 10th edition of the Human Anatomy and Physiology textbook. And I selected 6 textbook chapters to analyze for gender representation in the images and the graphics. So I chose muscular system, the special senses, endocrine system, nutrition, metabolism, and energy balance, the urinary system, and of course, the reproductive system. I recorded the number of images representing men and women in the text. So this includes any cartoonish figures where we can easily distinguish the sex of the person in the image, and any photographs of humans in these chapters that typically have a some text underneath, a caption that indicates the person's gender. I then calculated the means and the standard deviations for male versus female representation in Excel. And I conducted ANOVA, an analysis of variance testing to compare the means, obtain a p-value, and determine any significance of this research. So I'm working off of the null hypothesis that there is no difference between the means. So mean 1 is equal to mean 2, and then of course the alternate hypothesis would be that there does exist a difference between these two means. In other words, that the gender representation is not 50-50 balance between the sexes. As we can see by my results, there is not a significant difference between these means. And if you notice my error bars, there is a very wide standard deviation. So, of course, depending on the nature of the content in the chapter, some chapters had lots and lots of images depicting humans with assigned genders, and others were more specific to muscle groups or the pituitary gland, and there's not so much that gendered nature of the image. So that accounts for the large standard deviation that we have. But really there was not a significant difference between male and female appearances in the text. This is my ANOVA results, and this is a screenshot from the website that I use to help me calculate this, which is called Good Calculators, and that HTML is at the bottom. So the ANOVA test revealed that no significant difference exists in this data. The p-value was much higher than the alpha I used. I used that standard alpha of 0.05, so we're working with 95% here. So based on the data that I had available to me, I had to make the decision not to reject the null hypothesis. So I wondered, is this correct, or is this possibly a type 2 error? It is entirely possible that no difference exists within the textbook, and it is the correct decision to not reject the null hypothesis. But alternately, there might be, as we say, another population. There might be certainly a difference in the male and female representation in the text. And if I had time for further research, I could adjust some of the margins of my research to test for a type 2 error. So I could increase my sample size. In this study, my sample size was 6. I analyzed 6 textbook chapters, but there are many more textbook chapters, and I certainly could have increased that sample size, which might give me a different trend in my data. Additionally, I could decrease the standard deviation of my data, and that would help to narrow my curves and concentrate my data around the means, so the curves would not be quite so widely spread out. And this could actually be done by omitting some of the chapters that had Arrhenius numbers. So some of the chapters had quite a lot of images that were kind of an outlier. So I could omit those, recalculate, and that might give me a smaller standard deviation. Additionally, to control for a type 2 error, I could increase my alpha and see if that has any difference on my data. Additionally, I could amplify the treatment effect. So in regards to this study, I could intentionally seek and select chapters that I think might give me a greater difference between representation of the sexes, so that amplified treatment effect would drive my means away from each other, and perhaps then we would find a difference. Here are my sources cited. Thank you very much.